Imagine a world where power wasn't just won on battlefields or secured through bloodlines, but whispered into being by stars, sealed with sacred rituals and guarded by ancient spells. In the heart of the medieval age, kings and queens ruled not only with sword and crown but with the firm belief that their authority was intertwined with forces far beyond human understanding. This was a time when the boundaries between the earthly and the otherworldly blurred, when royal advisors peered into the heavens for signs, alchemists toiled in hidden chambers to unlock divine secrets, and monarchs placed their fates in the hands of mystical rituals. Far from being a mere backdrop to politics, mysticism shaped the very fabric of royal life, imbuing it with meaning, mystery, and majesty. This journey into the enchanted world of medieval royalty reveals a civilization not lost to time, but alive in the symbols, beliefs, and longings we still carry today. In the heart of the Middle Ages, the world was a place veiled in wonder, mystery, and an ever-present sense of the divine. Medieval royalty occupied a unique space in this world, not just as rulers of nations, but as sacred figures whose authority stemmed from a divine source. Kings and queens were not merely political leaders; they were considered chosen by God, often seen as having a mystical connection to the heavens. Their every move, from coronation to burial, was steeped in symbolism, ritual, and the firm belief that their rule was designed by forces far beyond mortal comprehension. The concept of divine right, the idea that monarchs were selected by God and thus unchallengeable, was a cornerstone of medieval kingship. This belief gave rulers not just political power but spiritual legitimacy. It wasn't enough to have a crown and an army; one needed the smoothing of the church, a public demonstration that heaven itself had sanctioned their reign. The coronation ceremony was not a mere formality but a sacred rite. In this elaborate event, the monarch would be anointed with holy oil, echoing the biblical tradition of King David being chosen by God. The act of anointing transformed the ruler into something more than human, an intermediary between God and the people, a living vessel of divine will. The royal court, therefore, was not just a center of administration and power but a kind of living temple. Everything within it, from the clothing worn by the monarchs to the architecture of their palaces, reinforced their divine status. Royal regalia, crowns, scepters, orbs were rich with religious symbolism. The crown often featured crosses and fleur-de-lis, symbolizing both Christian authority and purity. The globe, representing the world, showed that the monarch held dominion over all creation, but only through the grace of God. The scepter stood for justice and power, again granted from on high. These symbols were not taken lightly. They were believed to carry real power, and the theft or loss of such items was often seen as a catastrophic omen. Medieval chroniclers wrote of how natural disasters, defeats in battle, or plagues were interpreted as divine punishments for unworthy rulers. In some cases, kings were even deposed or forced to do self-punishment if it was thought they had fallen from divine favor. The well-being of the realm was inextricably linked to the spiritual state of the monarch. If the king sinned, it was believed the whole kingdom might suffer. Superstition and mysticism infused every aspect of royal life. Dreams were scrutinized for omens, stars were read by court astrologers, and strange occurrences were taken as messages from the beyond. Monarchs often surrounded themselves with mystics, priests, alchemists, and even magicians, figures who were believed to have access to hidden knowledge. These advisors could guide the monarch not only in political matters but in the spiritual and cosmic realms. Astrological charts were consulted before going into battle or arranging royal marriages. The alignment of planets could dictate when to crown a new king or whether a proposed union would be fruitful. One of the most intriguing aspects of medieval royal life was the presence of relics, physical objects believed to be imbued with divine power. These could be bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, or even garments said to have been worn by Christ or the Virgin Mary. Possessing such relics was seen as a sign of divine favor and a source of protection and legitimacy. Monarchs would go to great lengths to acquire them, sometimes sparking wars or diplomatic missions. These relics were displayed with great ceremony, often housed in elaborate chapels within royal palaces or cathedrals. Pilgrims would come from all over Christendom to see them, and their veneration further bolstered the king's sacred status. But the mystical dimension of medieval royalty went beyond ceremony and symbol. It also touched upon the miraculous. There were stories of kings who healed the sick by touch alone. The royal touch was particularly associated with the French and English monarchs, who were believed to have the power to cure scrofula, a type of tuberculosis. These healing rituals were not just public displays of piety, they were demonstrations of divine blessing, proof that the monarch's body itself was a conduit of heavenly grace. Thousands would attend these events, hoping for healing, and reinforcing the notion that the king was no ordinary man. The daily life of a medieval monarch was structured around religious devotion and ritual. Every royal household included a chapel, and daily mass was obligatory. Prayers were said at specific times of day, often announced by the tolling of bells, and the liturgical calendar structured the entire year. Feasts, fasts, saints' days, and holy seasons dictated royal activities. Major events, coronations, weddings, victories were celebrated with masses of thanksgiving. Even military campaigns were seen as religious endeavors. The Crusades, for instance, were not just wars but sacred pilgrimages, often led by kings who believed they were doing God's work. Yet the spiritual life of a monarch was not always serene. The constant pressure to maintain divine favor could be overwhelming. Some rulers turned to acts of extreme piety or penance. They founded monasteries, built cathedrals, or undertook pilgrimages to distant holy sites. Some donned sackcloth and ashes, confessed publicly, or walked barefoot to shrines. These acts were both personal expressions of faith and public demonstrations of humility before God. Monarchs were expected not just to rule but to embody virtue. Their moral failings were seen as national crises, and their redemption was often sought through displays of penitence and religious devotion. Despite their lofty status, medieval monarchs also feared the supernatural. Witchcraft, curses, and demonic influence were taken seriously at court. Some kings and queens went to great lengths to protect themselves, wearing jewels, seeking blessings from holy men, or commissioning magical texts. Tales abound of monarchs who consulted oracles, feared predictions, or were haunted by dreams of doom. The medieval worldview was one in which the spiritual world constantly intersected with the material, and no one, not even a king, was immune to its dangers. Even death did not end the mystical journey of royalty. Royal funerals were grand, spiritual affairs meant to guide the soul of the deceased to heaven. The king's body was washed, anointed, and dressed in religious vestments as if a priest. He lay in state surrounded by candles and incense, while choirs sang prayers for his soul. The funeral mass was the climax of the ritual, during which it was believed that prayers might speed the monarch's passage through purgatory. Tombs were placed in churches or cathedrals, adorned with angelic imagery and inscriptions pleading for the prayers of the living. For centuries, pilgrims would visit these tombs, praying for their own needs and for the soul of the departed king. Yet the mystical aura of medieval royalty was not just limited to Christian Europe. In the Islamic and Eastern Christian worlds, rulers were also seen as divinely chosen and spiritually significant. The caliphs of the Islamic empires were successors to the Prophet Muhammad and wielded immense religious authority. In Byzantium, the emperor was seen as God's representative on earth, with rituals and court ceremonies that rivaled anything in Western Europe in their grandeur and symbolism. In all these cultures, the idea of sacred kingship served the same purpose: to reinforce the monarch's authority, bind the people together under a divine order, and ensure the moral and spiritual well-being of the realm. As centuries passed and the Renaissance began to take hold, some of the mystical elements of kingship started to wane under the light of reason, humanism, and scientific inquiry. Yet even then, the allure of divine royalty lingered. Monarchs still staged elaborate coronations, invoked God in their proclamations, and ruled with a sense of divine mission. The mystical trappings might have faded, but the belief that kings and queens were something more than mortal persisted. In modern times, much of the mystery surrounding royalty has given way to political realism and constitutional limitations. Yet the echoes of that mystical past remain. We still speak of royal blood, watch coronations with awe, and treat monarchs with a reverence that seems out of place in a secular age. This lingering fascination is a testament to the power of the medieval imagination, a time when royalty was not just a matter of lineage or governance but a sacred role that connected the earthly and the divine. In exploring the mystical world of medieval royalty, one steps into a realm where power was prayerful, where palaces were sanctuaries, and where kings and queens moved through a world alive with angels, omens, saints, and portents. Their crowns were not just ornaments but symbols of celestial favor. Their courts were not merely political hubs but spiritual theaters. Their lives and deaths were tales etched in the sacred memory of a deeply religious world. The Middle Ages may lie far behind us, but the mystique of divine kingship continues to haunt our imagination, a reminder that once, long ago, to rule a kingdom was to hold a fragment of heaven in your hands. In the vast and shadowed halls of medieval courts, where power danced with mystery and belief intertwined itself with the unseen, alchemy stood as a bridge between science, spirituality, and royal ambition. To the modern mind, alchemy is often misunderstood as a naive precursor to chemistry, remembered mostly for its fabled goal of transforming lead into gold. But in the Middle Ages, alchemy was far more profound and far-reaching. For the royalty of that time, it represented a path to divine knowledge, a tool to manipulate the forces of nature, and a sacred science capable of granting health, wealth, wisdom, and even immortality. It was a tantalizing promise of control over both matter and spirit, and no king or queen could ignore its allure. At the heart of alchemical thought was the idea that all matter was composed of basic elements governed by universal laws. The transformation of base metals into noble ones such as gold was not merely a greedy ambition but a symbol of the larger alchemical goal to purify, perfect, and transmute. Gold, being the most perfect of metals, represented the pinnacle of physical and spiritual evolution. Just as lead might be refined into gold, so too might the human soul be purified, healed, and elevated. This concept of inner and outer transformation spoke directly to the medieval worldview, in which spiritual and physical realities were deeply intertwined. Royalty, seen as divinely chosen and charged with guiding their people, had a special interest in harnessing such powers for the good of their realm and themselves. Alchemy thus became a serious and often secretive pursuit in royal courts across Europe and beyond. Monarchs employed alchemists not just as curiosity makers or entertainers but as valued advisors, healers, and keepers of forbidden knowledge. These alchemists were often cloaked in mystery themselves. Some were monks, others wandering scholars, and a few were even nobles who had turned their attentions to the mysteries of matter and spirit. They were often multilingual, literate in Latin and Greek, and well-versed in the ancient texts of Egypt, Arabia, and classical antiquity. Their laboratories, sometimes hidden in the deepest parts of castles or monasteries, were filled with strange instruments, bubbling retorts, foul-smelling concoctions, and books thick with obscure symbols and coded instructions. The monarch's interest in alchemy was far from theoretical. Chief among their desires was the philosopher's stone, that mythical substance said to have the power to transmute any base metal into gold. Possession of such a thing would not merely make a king rich, it would be a sign of divine favor and ultimate mastery over nature. Gold was not simply wealth, it was purity, virtue, and perfection. For a monarch, being able to create it was tantamount to wielding the creative power of God. It signified supreme control, a right to rule not only by lineage or force, but by cosmic harmony. But gold was not the only goal. Another quest ran parallel, the search for the elixir of life. This fabled liquid was believed to halt aging, cure all illnesses, and grant immortality. The elixir symbolized wholeness, balance, and health in both body and spirit. Many rulers, surrounded by political intrigue and aware of their own mortality, longed for such a potion. They saw in alchemy a way to escape the frailty of the human condition. Monarchs who had seen their heirs die young, or who suffered from chronic illness, often turned to their court alchemists in desperation. These alchemists, using rare herbs, mineral preparations, and complex processes, would attempt to concoct tonics, salves, and potions meant to rejuvenate and protect. This blending of medicine and alchemy was especially important. In an age where disease and early death were ever-present threats, even royalty with access to the best physicians could be powerless against infection, poison, or congenital illness. Alchemists, with their theories of balancing the four humors and their deep knowledge of nature's hidden properties, were often consulted when traditional medicine failed. Their remedies, based on both observation and mystical insight, were believed to work on both the physical and spiritual levels. They aimed to realign the body's energies with the greater forces of the cosmos. Some alchemists even claimed to be able to extend life dramatically or restore youth. The presence of alchemy in royal courts wasn't limited to Europe. In the Islamic world, alchemy flourished under the guidance of scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan, whose works greatly influenced Western alchemical tradition. Islamic rulers, like their Christian counterparts, supported alchemists in their quest to understand the nature of reality and unlock the secrets of transformation. These scholars translated and preserved Greek and Egyptian knowledge, blending it with their own philosophical insights. Many of these texts would eventually find their way into European courts, fueling the imaginations of monarchs and scholars alike. The transmission of alchemical knowledge across cultures enriched its symbolic depth and practical ambitions. Despite its mystical nature, alchemy was deeply tied to experimentation and observation. Alchemists may have couched their language in riddles and symbols, but they performed real experiments. They distilled liquids, calcined substances, fermented materials, and noted chemical changes. Their work laid the groundwork for modern chemistry, but in their time, it remained firmly enmeshed in spiritual belief. Each transformation in the lab mirrored a transformation in the soul. Fire, for instance, was a sacred purifier. it symbolized divine judgment and renewal. The processes of dissolution and coagulation were not just chemical, they were metaphors for death and rebirth, for the soul's journey toward perfection. Royal patronage of alchemy was not without its risks. Not all alchemists were honest, and many were charlatans who promised the impossible to gain favor, money, or power. There are stories of impostors who were executed when they failed to produce gold or immortality. Yet this did little to lessen the monarch's fascination. The promise was simply too great. Kings and queens often kept their alchemical endeavors secret, fearing ridicule or political backlash. In some cases, royal involvement in alchemy was seen as dabbling in the forbidden, an affront to religious orthodoxy, or a flirtation with heresy. The Church, while sometimes tolerant of alchemical study, remained suspicious of its claims to divine power. One of the most famous royal patrons of alchemy was Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who ruled in the late 16th century. He transformed his court in Prague into a center of alchemical and esoteric learning, attracting mystics, astrologers, and alchemists from all over Europe. His fascination with hidden knowledge consumed much of his time and resources. For Rudolf and many like him, alchemy was not a fringe pursuit but a central concern, bound up with their vision of kingship and divine order. Even earlier, English kings like Edward III and Henry VI are known to have supported alchemical studies. Manuscripts bearing royal seals describe complex alchemical operations, and there are records of royal funds being allocated for alchemical research. Queen Elizabeth I's court saw similar interest, with figures like John Dee, a mathematician, astrologer, and alchemist, serving as advisors. Dee believed that understanding the natural world through alchemical and magical means could restore a lost divine harmony, and he advised the Queen on matters both scientific and spiritual. In France, King Charles VI reportedly kept alchemists at his court, hoping for cures to his mental illness and divine insight into his troubled reign. In Poland and Hungary, noble patrons supported alchemical presses and laboratories. Across Europe, one sees a pattern. Wherever power and mystery converged, alchemy found a home. But why was this arcane science so enduring in royal circles, despite its failures and controversies? The answer lies in its unique ability to unify opposites. Alchemy was both a spiritual philosophy and a practical craft. It promised divine wisdom and earthly riches. It spoke to a monarch's desire for control in an unpredictable world, a means of bending nature to human will, of achieving certainty in a world of plague, war, and decay. It gave form to hopes that transcended the immediate and pointed toward the eternal. For kings and queens, alchemy represented more than the sum of its parts. It was a way to grapple with mortality, to strive toward perfection, to understand God's creation, and to exert dominion not just over land and people, but over the very fabric of reality. Its arcane symbols, its riddles and allegories, its long nights of experimentation under flickering candlelight, these were not mere superstitions, but expressions of a deep and noble yearning. A yearning to know, to heal, to perfect. In many ways, alchemy mirrored the structure of royal life. Just as alchemists believed in a hierarchy of elements and a great chain of being, so too did monarchs see themselves at the pinnacle of a divinely ordered society. Alchemy's obsession with harmony, balance, and the proper arrangement of parts echoed the ideals of good governance and just rule. The philosopher king was an ideal shared by alchemists and rulers alike, one who combined wisdom with power, intellect with action, spirit with substance. Though modern science eventually outgrew the metaphysical frameworks of alchemy, it owes a quiet debt to its medieval roots. The early pursuit of substances and their transformations led to discoveries that would form the basis of chemistry, metallurgy, and pharmacology. But in royal courts, alchemy remained more than a precursor to science. It was a vision of ultimate knowledge, a sacred endeavor that drew kings into its secret circle. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance and Enlightenment, alchemy began to recede from the center of royal concern. Yet its legacy endured, not only in the scientific advancements it inspired but in the lingering sense of wonder it instilled. Even now, when we speak of political transformations, sudden success, or mysterious brilliance, we use the language of alchemy. We still dream, as the kings of old did, of turning the ordinary into the extraordinary, of finding hidden truths in the material world, and of touching something eternal. In the dimly lit chambers of castles long vanished, beneath vaulted ceilings and behind heavy tapestries, kings and queens once gathered in whispered councils with their alchemists. Together they dreamed of a world remade where gold flowed like water, disease was vanquished, age reversed, and the secrets of the universe laid bare. It was a dream of power, yes, but also of understanding. A dream that united heaven and earth in the flame of the alchemist's fire and in the royal heart's deepest longing. In the intricate web of medieval life, where every event was seen through a lens of divine purpose and cosmic significance, astrology held a place of deep reverence and authority. For the kings and queens who ruled vast territories, the stars were not merely distant lights in the sky but active forces that shaped their destinies, influenced their decisions, and provided divine insight into the workings of the world. Astrology in this context was not a mere pastime or superstition. It was a tool of governance, a guide to fate, and a mirror through which rulers glimpsed their place in the divine order of the cosmos. The medieval worldview was fundamentally different from the secular rationalism of the modern age. It was a universe of signs and symbols, where the material and spiritual realms were deeply intertwined. Everything had meaning, from the flight of birds to the phases of the moon. Among all these signs, the movements of the stars and planets were considered the most significant, as they were believed to reflect the divine will more clearly than any other phenomenon. In this celestial order, astrology emerged as a discipline of immense importance, offering a way to interpret these heavenly signs and apply their meanings to earthly affairs. For medieval royalty, astrology provided a framework to understand their birth, character, and destiny. The moment of a monarch's birth was recorded with great care, not just to mark succession but to calculate a natal chart, a map of the heavens at the exact time of their entry into the world. This chart was believed to reveal much about their personality, strengths and weaknesses, inclinations, and most importantly, their fate. Astrologers would examine the positions of the sun, moon, and planets in relation to the zodiac signs and the 12 astrological houses, each governing different aspects of life such as wealth, health, power, and relationships. A favorable alignment might be taken as a sign of divine favor, indicating a ruler destined for greatness, wisdom, or victory. Conversely, ominous aspects or difficult planetary conjunctions could suggest a reign filled with strife, betrayal, or illness. These interpretations were taken seriously and often influenced how a monarch was raised, educated, and prepared for rule. Even events such as coronations and royal baptisms were sometimes timed to align with auspicious planetary configurations to ensure success and divine harmony. The role of court astrologers was both respected and feared. These individuals, often highly educated in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine, held positions of considerable influence. They were consulted not only for personal readings but for advice on matters of state. Before launching a military campaign, a king might seek an astrologer's counsel to determine the most propitious time to march or attack. During peace negotiations or marriage alliances, astrology played a role in assessing compatibility and timing. A union between two royal houses, for example, might be delayed or advanced based on planetary alignments to ensure the marriage would be fruitful and politically advantageous. The stars were also believed to influence the outcomes of battles, the fertility of the land, the rise and fall of kingdoms, and the health of the monarch. In times of crisis, plagues, famines, rebellions, astrologers were often summoned to interpret the heavens and offer explanations. Eclipses, comets, and unusual celestial events were particularly significant. An eclipse during a monarch's reign might be viewed as an omen of death or downfall. A comet blazing across the sky could be interpreted as a divine warning or the herald of a great change. Monarchs would order prayers, fasts, or acts of penance in response, attempting to realign themselves and their realm with the celestial order. Astrology also shaped how monarchs viewed themselves and their roles. The belief that their reign was written in the stars reinforced the idea of divine right and cosmic legitimacy. A king born under the sign of Leo might be seen as naturally brave and commanding, born to lead and protect. A queen under Libra could be viewed as a bringer of justice and harmony. These characteristics were not mere archetypes but spiritual truths that shaped how rulers conducted themselves and were perceived by others. Their horoscopes were not just private tools but public symbols of their ordained destiny. Divination extended beyond astrology into other forms of mystical insight. Court magicians and seers used a variety of methods to peer into the future or uncover hidden truths. These might include the casting of lots, the reading of animal entrails, the interpretation of dreams, or the use of crystal balls and scrying mirrors. While the Church often condemned divination as heretical or dangerous, it tolerated or even supported astrological inquiry, especially when practiced by scholars who framed their work within a Christian worldview. This tension led to a complex relationship between faith and astrology, with theologians debating whether the stars merely influenced or actually determined human actions. Despite these debates, astrology remained deeply embedded in medieval court life. Royal archives contain numerous horoscopes, astrological treatises, and correspondence between monarchs and their astrologers. Kings and queens not only employed astrologers but often studied astrology themselves. The subject was part of the broader quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy that formed the higher curriculum of medieval education. A well-rounded ruler was expected to have at least a basic understanding of celestial mechanics and their implications. Some monarchs became especially known for their reliance on astrology. Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, had a deep interest in science and astrology, commissioning translations of Arabic astrological texts and hosting scholars at his court. Queen Elizabeth I of England famously consulted the astrologer John Dee, who provided guidance on everything from political strategy to foreign policy, all through the lens of celestial insight. Dee, like many astrologers of his time, blended astrology with alchemy, mathematics, and mysticism, offering a vision of knowledge that united the physical and metaphysical realms. Other notable figures include Charles V of France, who supported numerous astrologers and astrologically scheduled many of his political actions. The Medicis in Renaissance Florence also employed astrologers and kept detailed astrological records of their family members. Even in the Islamic world, rulers like the Abbasid caliphs maintained observatories and supported astrologers who blended Greek and Persian traditions with Islamic theology. The calendars used by royal courts were often adjusted based on astrological knowledge. Important decisions, including the founding of cities, the beginning of harvests, and the timing of festivals, were linked to celestial cycles. The belief in planetary hours, specific times of day ruled by different planets, also influenced court schedules, rituals, and prayers. A king might choose to sign a treaty during an hour ruled by Jupiter, the planet of fortune and justice, while avoiding actions during Saturn's hour, which was associated with limitation and sorrow. In moments of uncertainty, when reason failed and outcomes hung in the balance, it was to the stars that royalty often turned. Astrology provided a sense of order, a promise that life's chaos could be deciphered, that fate could be known if not controlled. It gave monarchs a framework to understand their triumphs and tragedies not just as random events but as part of a grand cosmic plan. This belief, deeply comforting and immensely powerful, shaped how they governed, fought, married, and even died. Yet astrology was never infallible. History is replete with examples of prophecies gone awry or predictions that failed to come to pass. But in a world where uncertainty reigned, even flawed guidance from the heavens was better than none. Astrology offered more than predictions, it offered meaning. It transformed suffering into sacrifice, coincidence into destiny, and leadership into a sacred duty governed by the stars. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, astrology's status began to shift. It moved from the heart of courtly life to the fringes of acceptable science. The rise of empirical observation, heliocentrism, and mathematical astronomy slowly pushed astrology into the realm of superstition. But even as its scientific credibility waned, its symbolic power endured. Monarchs continued to seek astrological advice into the early modern era, and the language of signs and omens persisted in literature, art, and politics. In modern times, astrology survives in popular culture more than in palaces. But its medieval legacy remains a fascinating testament to a time when rulers looked upward for guidance, believing the stars not only watched over them but shaped their very being. It speaks to a world in which the heavens and the earth were bound in a mystical dance, where every flicker of light held a message, and every planetary movement was part of a divine script. The stars were not silent to medieval royalty. They spoke in subtle patterns and powerful signs, offering glimpses of truth to those wise or bold enough to listen. The rulers of that age lived with the belief that their fate was written in the stars, not as a limitation but as a calling. Through astrology and divination, they sought to understand their role in the cosmic order, to make decisions not just with reason but with reverence, and to rule in harmony with the heavens. In doing so, they reminded the world that leadership was not merely about might or birthright, but about aligning oneself with the eternal rhythms of the universe. In the medieval world, power was never taken for granted. Kings and queens, despite their apparent authority and wealth, existed within a fragile web of alliances, divine mandates, and ever-looming threats to their reign. To maintain their position and reinforce their legitimacy, medieval monarchs did not merely rely on armies or law, they employed a complex language of ritual, ceremony, and symbolism. These rituals of power, ranging from coronations to royal feasts, hunts, and daily courtly practices, served as essential tools in the shaping of royal identity, the safeguarding of the throne, and the projection of sovereignty. Every gesture, costume, word, and event carried layers of meaning, binding the monarch to divine forces and broadcasting authority to the realm. Among the most significant of all royal rituals was the coronation ceremony. Far more than a political event, a coronation was a sacred rite that fused church and state, the human and the divine. It was a moment where a ruler was publicly and spiritually transformed into a sovereign, chosen by God. During the medieval period, coronations followed elaborate liturgical procedures, typically conducted by the highest-ranking clergy in the land, often an archbishop. The monarch would first be presented to the people, an acknowledgement that while their authority came from God, it was also ratified by the acceptance of their subjects. Next came the oath, where the monarch swore to uphold justice, protect the church and rule with wisdom and mercy. The anointing, one of the most mystical elements of the ceremony, involved consecrated oil being applied to the monarch's head, chest, and hands. This act echoed the biblical anointing of kings such as David and Solomon and was viewed as a direct channeling of divine favor. It created a spiritual transformation that could not be undone. Following the anointing came the crowning itself, often using a heavily jeweled crown that symbolized divine authority and the weight of the realm. The monarch was then enthroned and presented with regalia such as a sword, orb, scepter, and ring, all rich in Christian symbolism. These items represented not just royal power but moral responsibility, reminding the monarch of their duty to rule justly. This sacred theater established a monarch's legitimacy in the eyes of both God and their subjects. But rituals of power did not end at coronation, they permeated every aspect of royal life. State occasions, royal weddings, funerals, and annual festivals were opportunities to reassert royal identity and project authority. Banquets and feasts, for example, were not only celebrations, they were performances where social hierarchies were reinforced, and the monarch's generosity and magnificence were put on full display. The seating arrangements, the courses of food, the music, and even the garments worn were laden with meaning. At such events, every act served a political and symbolic purpose. Loyalty was rewarded, status was affirmed, and the majesty of the court was broadcast throughout the realm. Royal hunts were another key ritual, rich in symbolism and political weight. More than sport, hunting was a demonstration of royal control over nature and a metaphor for governance itself. The ability to master wild beasts was paralleled with the ability to tame disorder in the kingdom. The hunting grounds, often restricted royal forests, symbolized exclusive authority over land and law. These outings also offered opportunities for bonding with nobles, negotiating alliances, and subtly reminding everyone of the monarch's prowess and vitality. A ruler who hunted was strong, virile, and capable, a message not lost on subjects and foreign ambassadors alike. Equally important were the rituals tied to justice. The king's presence in court or at public hearings was a highly choreographed affair, with strict protocols observed to emphasize impartiality, wisdom, and divine inspiration. The dispensation of justice was one of the most visible expressions of royal power, and it too was steeped in ceremonial gravitas. Royal judges wore robes and insignias that echoed the authority of the crown. The king's word was seen as final and binding, an earthly echo of divine justice. By appearing as a moral arbiter, the monarch affirmed not only their authority but their sacred duty to uphold divine law. Religion and monarchy were inseparable in the Middle Ages, and religious rituals formed the backbone of royal life. Monarchs participated in the liturgical calendar, sponsored masses, endowed monasteries, and often had personal confessors and chaplains. Major religious festivals such as Easter and Christmas were moments of heightened ceremonial activity where monarchs would appear before the people, distribute alms, and engage in public worship. These events reaffirmed the monarch's role as both a temporal and spiritual leader. Royal relics such as fragments of the true cross or saints' bones were kept in treasuries and often paraded through cities to demonstrate divine favor and sanctity. Rituals of healing and well-being also had a mystical dimension. Monarchs in England and France, for instance, were believed to have the royal touch, a divine gift to cure scrofula, a disease also known as the king's evil. Ceremonies where the king laid hands on the sick were attended by thousands, blending Christian belief with royal mystique. The ability to heal was not just a miracle but proof of divine selection. These ceremonies served to create a personal bond between the monarch and their people, presenting the ruler not only as a sovereign but as a spiritual protector. In times of crisis such as war, plague, or rebellion, special rituals were performed to protect the throne and restore divine order. Fasting, processions, and mass prayers were organized, often led by the monarch themselves. Public penance or pilgrimages by royalty were potent gestures, signaling humility, repentance, and a desire to realign with divine will. These acts helped maintain public faith in the monarchy during difficult times and emphasized the king or queen's sacred duty to the welfare of the realm. The use of space in royal ritual also carried symbolic power. Palaces and castles were more than residences, they were stages for performance. The layout of rooms, the placement of thrones, and the design of chapels reflected hierarchical values and spiritual beliefs. The throne room, for instance, was usually elevated, symbolizing the monarch's superior status and divine perspective. Even the act of walking down a corridor or appearing on a balcony had ritual importance. Public appearances were carefully timed and choreographed. Royal processions through towns and cities created living tableaus of authority, awe, and majesty. Crowds gathered not just to see their ruler but to witness a living symbol of cosmic and political order. Symbolism permeated royal clothing and regalia. The use of purple, gold, and ermine signaled majesty and divine favor. Crowns, rings, and brooches often bore religious motifs, saints, or celestial bodies. Such items were believed to carry protective powers, shielding the monarch from curses or assassination attempts. The belief in enchanted or blessed objects was widespread. Swords passed down through generations, like the legendary Excalibur, were more than weapons, they were talismans linking the ruler to myth, legacy, and divine justice. Even mundane acts could carry ritual significance. The act of kneeling before the monarch, the kiss of homage, or the formal granting of a title were saturated with layers of meaning. Each was a reaffirmation of hierarchy, loyalty, and divine favor. Royal marriages, too, were deeply ritualistic, serving political and symbolic purposes. These unions often required elaborate negotiations and were celebrated with festivals that included public proclamations, elaborate banquets, and the exchange of costly gifts. The bride and groom, adorned in symbolic attire, represented not just personal union but the merging of dynasties and the blessing of God upon the alliance. Children born to royalty were swiftly woven into this fabric of ritual. Their baptisms were elaborate affairs, symbolizing spiritual purity and dynastic continuity. Heirs were groomed from a young age to understand the rituals they would one day perform. Their training included not just military and administrative skills but a thorough understanding of ceremonial protocol. This education ensured the smooth continuation of royal authority and its mystique. In many ways, these rituals were both a shield and a mirror. They protected the throne by reinforcing the monarch's special status, ensuring continuity, and binding subjects to a shared vision of order and hierarchy. But they also reflected the anxieties of rule, the fear of rebellion, the threat of usurpation, the instability of health and mortality. By embedding power in ritual, medieval royalty sought to stabilize an inherently unstable system. Rituals offered permanence in a world where life was uncertain and death could strike without warning. The effectiveness of these rituals lay in their repetition and familiarity. Subjects understood their significance, and participation in them, whether as nobles or peasants, reinforced social cohesion and the legitimacy of the monarch. While their meanings could evolve over time, their central function remained constant: to make royal power visible, tangible, and sacred. Even as the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance and eventually the modern state, many of these rituals endured in modified forms. Coronations are still performed in many monarchies, and royal weddings continue to attract global attention. The symbolic power of ritual has not disappeared, it has simply evolved. Yet the medieval roots of these practices remain a testament to a time when power was not just possessed but performed, not just inherited but sanctified, not just wielded but ritually revealed. In that age, the throne was more than a seat of governance, it was an altar, a stage, and a symbol of cosmic order. The monarch was more than a ruler, they were a bridge between heaven and earth, a living emblem of stability in a world perpetually threatened by chaos. Through ritual, medieval royalty did not merely survive, they shaped destiny, enforced loyalty, and cloaked their authority in a mantle of awe, mystery, and divine will. In a world transformed by science, technology, and rational thought, the enduring presence of mysticism might appear paradoxical. Yet, it remains a powerful force in modern life, subtly influencing beliefs, practices, and cultural expressions across societies. The medieval era, with its rich tapestry of magical thought, spiritual yearning, and supernatural inquiry, left behind more than illuminated manuscripts and ruined abbeys. It bequeathed a legacy of mysticism that continues to captivate the modern imagination. From tarot decks and astrological charts to esoteric rituals and spiritual movements, medieval mysticism persists not as a relic of the past but as a living tradition, transformed and reshaped by time yet firmly rooted in its origins. During the medieval period, the mystical and the material were not seen as separate realms but as interwoven aspects of a single, divinely ordered cosmos. The supernatural world was not an abstract idea, it was an everyday reality. Angels, demons, saints, omens and signs were integral to understanding life, fate and the will of God. Mysticism was a pathway to transcendence, a means of connecting with the divine beyond the limitations of the physical world. Whether through contemplative prayer, alchemical experimentation or astrological forecasting, people sought to access hidden truths and unseen forces. These practices, although often marginalized or misunderstood in later eras, have proven remarkably resilient, adapting to new cultural contexts while retaining their essential allure. One of the most enduring legacies of medieval mysticism is astrology. In medieval Europe, astrology was considered a legitimate science, practiced by scholars, monks, and physicians alike. The movements of the stars and planets were believed to influence human affairs, shaping destinies and reflecting divine order. Birth charts, planetary alignments, and horoscopes were used to guide decisions in everything from agriculture to warfare to marriage. Kings consulted astrologers before battles, and doctors relied on celestial insights to diagnose and treat illness. Astrology offered a sense of order in a chaotic world, suggesting that fate was not random but written in the heavens. Today, despite the advancements of astronomy and the decline of astrology as a scientific discipline, the fascination with celestial influence remains powerful. Modern horoscopes, birth charts, and zodiac compatibility readings are widely consumed across cultures and demographics. Astrology apps are downloaded by millions, and social media is filled with memes and content centered on astrological themes. This contemporary resurgence is not simply nostalgia, it reflects a deep psychological and spiritual need to find meaning and pattern in life, much like the medieval peoples who once watched the same stars with similar wonder. While the language and tools may have changed, the underlying desire to understand one's place in the cosmos remains constant. Tarot, another mystical practice with medieval roots, has likewise enjoyed a remarkable revival in modern times. Originally emerging in the late Middle Ages as a card game, tarot decks became instruments of divination in the Renaissance and were later codified into systems of esoteric symbolism by 19th-century occultists. Each card in the tarot, the Fool, the Magician, Death, the Tower, carries rich imagery rooted in medieval archetypes, spiritual teachings, and philosophical concepts. Tarot readings today are used for reflection, guidance, and personal insight. They function not only as tools for fortune-telling but as gateways to inner understanding, a way of accessing the subconscious and navigating life's uncertainties. The modern popularity of tarot is a direct reflection of the medieval legacy of symbolic thinking. In an age that often emphasizes logic and empiricism, tarot offers a symbolic language through which people can explore emotions, relationships, and personal growth. It appeals to a longing for mystery and meaning that is timeless. The medieval belief that symbols could bridge the gap between the visible and the invisible continues to resonate, showing how deeply embedded these mystical frameworks still are in human consciousness. Alchemy, once a cornerstone of medieval mystical science, has also left a subtle but profound imprint on contemporary spiritual and psychological thought. In the Middle Ages, alchemy was not simply about turning lead into gold, it was a sacred science, a symbolic quest for transformation, enlightenment, and union with the divine. Alchemists believed that the purification of matter mirrored the purification of the soul. Their processes, calcination, dissolution, coagulation, were metaphors for inner change. Though discredited as a physical science, alchemy's deeper, symbolic meanings survived and found new life in modern psychology, particularly in the work of Carl Jung. Jung saw alchemy as a metaphor for individuation, the process of integrating the conscious and unconscious self to achieve psychological wholeness. He explored alchemical texts not for their chemical content, but for their symbolic richness and insight into the human psyche. Today, many spiritual seekers and psychological theorists draw on alchemical imagery to describe personal growth and transformation. The language of inner alchemy, transmutation, rebirth, integration remains vital, echoing the medieval belief in the possibility of spiritual ascent through symbolic engagement with the world. Beyond these specific practices, the medieval mystical worldview has influenced broader modern movements such as New Age spirituality, Wicca, and various forms of contemporary esotericism. These traditions often draw directly from medieval sources, including Hermetic writings, Kabbalah, and Christian mysticism. The idea that hidden knowledge can lead to enlightenment, that rituals can open pathways to higher realities, and that the divine can be encountered through personal experience all have medieval antecedents. Whether it's crystal healing, chakra balancing, or magical rituals, much of what is today labeled alternative spirituality owes its conceptual framework to the mystics, alchemists, and astrologers of the medieval world. Christian mysticism itself, which flourished in the medieval period through figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Meister Eckhart, and Julian of Norwich, continues to inspire spiritual seekers. These mystics emphasized inner experience, divine union, and the transformative power of contemplative prayer. Their writings are still read today, not only by theologians but by those seeking a deeper, more intimate connection with the sacred. Their visions, insights, and poetic expressions of divine love transcend time and continue to speak to the human soul's longing for transcendence. Modern interest in mysticism also intersects with popular culture. Films, novels, video games, and television shows frequently draw on medieval mystical motifs: secret societies, sacred relics, enchanted objects, divine quests. Stories like the Da Vinci Code, Harry Potter, or The Lord of the Rings are saturated with magical thinking, hidden knowledge, and archetypal struggles between light and darkness. These narratives tap into the same psychological and spiritual currents that fueled medieval mysticism. They captivate us because they echo ancient themes of mystery, initiation, transformation, and cosmic justice. Even science, often seen as mysticism's opposite, has been influenced by mystical thought. Early scientific pioneers like Isaac Newton were deeply immersed in alchemy and biblical prophecy. The boundaries between science, magic, and religion were porous in the medieval world, and echoes of that unity still linger. Today, theoretical physics, with its talk of multiverses, dark matter, and quantum entanglement, sometimes evokes a sense of awe and wonder reminiscent of mystical revelation. While grounded in empirical research, these concepts challenge our perceptions of reality in ways that feel almost supernatural. For many, science has become a new kind of mysticism, offering not certainties but questions, paradoxes, and mysteries yet to be solved. The resurgence of interest in meditation, mindfulness, and contemplative practices also reveals the continuing appeal of mystical experience. In the medieval world, mysticism was often about direct, non-rational experience of the divine, a silence beyond words, a light beyond seeing. Modern spiritual practices, whether rooted in Eastern or Western traditions, often aim for similar states of consciousness. The rise of retreats, spiritual direction, and mystical poetry in the contemporary spiritual landscape is a testament to the enduring human desire for connection with something greater than oneself. Moreover, the digital age has provided new platforms for exploring and sharing mystical content. Online communities, podcasts, YouTube channels, and social media accounts dedicated to astrology, tarot, alchemy, and mysticism have flourished. People from all walks of life share readings, interpretations, and spiritual insights, building networks of modern mystics who, despite the technological medium, are engaged in practices that have changed little in essence since the Middle Ages. The democratization of mystical knowledge, once the purview of secluded scholars and monastics, is perhaps one of the most profound transformations of this legacy, making the mystical accessible to all. Yet, the persistence of mysticism in modern times is not merely a cultural artifact or aesthetic preference. It points to a deeper truth about human nature, the need to find meaning, to connect with something beyond the material, to explore the unknown. Medieval mysticism arose in a world of uncertainty, where disease, war, and death loomed large. In many ways, our world is no less uncertain. Despite technological progress, we grapple with existential threats, social fragmentation, and spiritual hunger. Mysticism offers a response not by providing easy answers, but by inviting us into deeper questions. It encourages humility in the face of mystery, reverence for the unseen, and a recognition of the sacred in the everyday. Ultimately, the legacy of medieval mysticism endures because it speaks to the soul. It reminds us that beneath the surface of ordinary life lies a hidden depth, a world of symbols, forces, and truths waiting to be discovered. Whether through the turn of a tarot card, the alignment of planets, the silence of meditation, or the pages of a mystic's journal, we continue to seek what the medieval world never stopped seeking: a glimpse of the divine, a touch of the eternal, a sense that life is more than what we see. In this way, mysticism acts as a bridge between past and present, between the medieval and the modern. It is not a rejection of reason but a complement to it, an acknowledgement that the human experience is as much about wonder as it is about knowledge. From Gothic cathedrals to candlelit readings, from ancient grimoires to digital horoscopes, the spirit of medieval mysticism endures. It lives in our stories, our rituals, our dreams, and our endless quest for meaning. And as long as that quest continues, so too will the mystical flame that was kindled centuries ago in monasteries, castles, and quiet hearts across the medieval world. The enduring presence of mysticism in both the past and the present is not a simple artifact of superstition or outdated beliefs, but a deep and persistent aspect of the human experience. From the vaulted halls of medieval castles to the digital spaces of the modern age, the mystical has never truly disappeared. Instead, it has transformed, evolved, and adapted to the changing tides of culture, science, religion, and technology. The Middle Ages, often misrepresented as a period of intellectual darkness, were in truth a profoundly rich and complex era where the sacred and the mundane were entwined, where the lines between the earthly and the divine were porous and alive with meaning. Mysticism during this time was not marginal, it was foundational, shaping the beliefs, actions, and worldviews of both rulers and commoners alike. For medieval royalty in particular, mysticism was far more than an abstract philosophical interest. It was central to their understanding of power, legitimacy, and destiny. Kings and queens were not simply political figures. They were seen as divinely appointed, charged with a sacred duty to uphold the cosmic order. This belief system was supported and reinforced through rituals, symbolism, and mystical practices that transcended the material world. Coronations were not merely political ceremonies, they were sacred rites invoking divine approval. Royal processions, court rituals, hunts, and feasts were embedded with allegory and spiritual meaning. Every gesture, every word, every object used in these rituals reinforced the divine right of kings and the notion that the monarchy was not just human, but supernatural in origin and nature. Alchemy, as practiced in royal courts and monastic laboratories, illustrates the medieval desire to reconcile the physical with the spiritual. It was never just about producing gold or eternal life in a literal sense, it was a metaphor for inner transformation, for the perfection of the soul. Monarchs often sponsored alchemists not only in the hope of increasing wealth or securing their health but because these practitioners represented the promise of unlocking the secrets of the universe. The philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, and the transmutation of base metals were also symbols of the transformation of the human spirit from ignorance to enlightenment, from sin to purity. In their interest in alchemy, monarchs revealed their vulnerability, their desire for permanence in a transient world, and their ambition to transcend the limits of mortal life. Astrology served a similarly crucial role. To the medieval mind, the stars and planets were not distant, lifeless rocks, but living forces that shaped the destiny of nations and the fates of individuals. Royalty depended on astrologers for decisions both great and small, from the timing of military campaigns to the selection of marriage partners. An unfavorable alignment of Mars and Saturn could postpone a coronation or alter a political alliance. Astrologers wielded great influence, for they offered access to a divine script written in the sky. In this view, kings and queens were not entirely free agents. They were actors in a celestial drama, their roles ordained by the cosmos. The belief in astrology offered both a sense of control and an acknowledgement of destiny, reflecting a worldview that was both fatalistic and empowering. Divination, dreams, omens, and prophecies further reflected the omnipresence of the mystical in royal life. Monarchs frequently employed seers, consulted oracles, and paid attention to strange events or signs, interpreting them as divine messages. A comet in the sky could signal the rise of a new ruler or the fall of a dynasty. A dream might be analyzed by court mystics for its hidden warnings or blessings. These practices were not viewed as eccentric but as essential tools of governance. To rule wisely was to remain attuned to the spiritual undercurrents of the world. The mystical provided not only explanations but also guidance, revealing hidden truths and helping monarchs navigate the complexities of politics, war, health, and succession. Rituals of power, so vital to maintaining royal legitimacy, were steeped in mystical thought. The act of placing a crown on a monarch's head was not merely symbolic, it was believed to channel divine energy, marking the ruler as chosen by God. Sacred oils, relics of saints, and elaborate garments were used in coronations to emphasize the sacred character of kingship. Processions mimicked celestial order, while feast days echoed the structure of divine feasts in heaven. Even mundane royal events such as hunts or births were surrounded by layers of mystical interpretation and symbolic meaning. In these rituals, the supernatural was not an addition to royal life, it was its foundation. Without the blessing of the divine, no power could be considered legitimate. Without ritual, that blessing could not be assured. As centuries passed and the Enlightenment ushered in a new era of scientific reasoning and skepticism, many of these mystical beliefs were questioned, marginalized, or ridiculed. Yet they never fully disappeared. Instead, they were absorbed into new frameworks: psychological, spiritual, literary, and cultural. The mystical legacy of the medieval world flowed underground for a time, only to resurface in unexpected ways. Romanticism in the 18th and 19th centuries rekindled interest in the mystical, emphasizing emotion, imagination, and the sublime. Occult revivals during the Victorian era resurrected medieval texts, symbols, and practices. Tarot, astrology, alchemy, and ritual magic were reinterpreted and popularized, bridging the past and the present in ways that felt at once ancient and revolutionary. In our own time, the mystical has re-emerged with striking vitality. In an era of technological saturation and spiritual disconnection, many are turning back to the practices and beliefs that once shaped the lives of medieval monarchs. Astrology is flourishing anew, not only in popular media but in serious spiritual circles. Tarot is used for introspection and healing, while alchemy has become a metaphor for personal growth and transformation. Meditation and mysticism are practiced by millions seeking meaning, wholeness, and connection in a fragmented world. Even rituals, stripped of their medieval trappings, are finding new life in ceremonies of self-discovery, healing, and transition. Why does this matter? Because the mystical worldview offers something the modern world often lacks: a sense of wonder, purpose, and participation in something greater than oneself. In a society that often prizes speed, efficiency, and material success, the mystical invites us to slow down, to look inward, and to reconnect with the timeless rhythms of the cosmos and the soul. It teaches us that there is wisdom in silence, power in symbols, and truth in the unseen. This perspective is not limited by dogma. It is expansive, inclusive, and deeply human. Moreover, the legacy of medieval mysticism challenges the simplistic narrative that progress requires the abandonment of the spiritual or the irrational. The history of thought is not a straight line from ignorance to enlightenment. It is a tapestry of ideas, beliefs, and insights, many of which still hold relevance. The medieval world, far from being a dark age, offers a luminous reminder that knowledge and mystery can coexist, that reason and wonder are not enemies but allies. In reflecting on the mysticism of medieval royalty, we are not merely studying a bygone era, we are looking into a mirror. We see our own desires for meaning, our fears of mortality, our hopes for transcendence. We see how power can be legitimized not only by law but by myth, how leadership is not only a political act but a spiritual one. We see how rituals, symbols, and beliefs shape societies, forging identities and guiding actions. And we see how, across centuries and cultures, the mystical continues to speak to kings and commoners alike. The mystical world of medieval royalty is not just an intriguing chapter of history, it is a living legacy. Its influence persists in the stories we tell, the symbols we cherish, the questions we ask, and the paths we walk in search of wisdom. Whether through the turning of tarot cards, the tracking of planetary movements, the performance of ritual, or the quiet moments of inner contemplation, we remain heirs to a tradition that seeks not only to understand the world but to experience its deepest mysteries. In that search, the spirit of medieval mysticism endures not as a relic of the past, but as a vital, vibrant part of our collective soul.